Glad to see you this morning. Welcome to our worship here at RNC. At least for Daniel and I, the second time, and for the elders and ministers, the second time out of 3 today. Glad to have you here. Hopefully you grabbed a bulletin on your way in. Want to mention just a couple of things there. Jake mentioned the trunk or treat, kind of a COVID-style trunk or treat. It's going to be a little shorter, a little briefer than what it normally would. We're not going to feed folks. It's going to take about 30 minutes. You're asked to sign up your kids with a QR code there in the bulletin, and you'll go there and just simply put your name and what 30-minute slot you're going to show up for. And please don't show up until that spot. We're trying to kind of keep our numbers down at any given time through that. Also asking those of us who are grandparents, who are empty nesters, or maybe young ones that don't have children, to help us host the event for our children. And so there's another QR code, if you would. You can go there and you can sign up to decorate a truck bed, to host a game, either a game that you've thought of and you'll bring, or one that we'll provide for you to man. And there's also a place you can go to sign up to bring candy to be given out to the kids. You also probably noticed the front of the bulletin, a little note there, which is pretty straightforward, but I think you'll understand. Our main concern, we're concerned, we want to have everybody here, but at the same time we realize that we've got to have everybody here safely. And so our main concern has to be that our assemblies do not become a place where the virus is spread. Because the simple truth of that is at any point that we understand that the virus was transmitted at this assembly, then we basically have to shut this assembly down for 2 weeks. So we don't want to do that. So we ask you to be vigilant about the masks and about distancing, about leaving the auditorium immediately, so that you can do your visiting outside, so that we have time to fog in here between services. And so we simply ask you that if you're not feeling well, worship from home. Worship from home if you've been around folks who have tested positive. And just help us while you're here to observe the guidelines that we have in place. We appreciate your cooperation in those things. And as the note there on the front of the bulletin says, it's about considering others, and about considering others ahead of yourself. That's basically what it comes down to. We're talking today, our title of the lesson is Trust and Obey. Subtitled The Dichotomy of Doing, because talking about doing and what motivates our doing. Doing comes in basically 2 halves, hence the idea of dichotomy. Do we do what we do because of something, or do we do what we do for something in return? We have one of those 2 purposes in about anything we do. I don't think there's anyone here who will go to work tomorrow morning because your boss has just been so kind and gracious to you. If you find out today that you won't be paid for working tomorrow, you probably won't show up. Yet many people in your life, you will be kind and gracious and do things for and be loving toward, not because of what you might in the future receive from them, but simply who they are and what they have done for you and what they mean to you. The Bible is very clear on the topic. We serve and we do because of. Those who serve in order to receive have gotten things out of order. And that's really the main point of what we want to say this morning. Go with me to Colossians chapter 1, if you would. Let's begin there. Colossians chapter 1, verses 9 and 10. And then we'll also look at verses 13 and 14. 9 and 10 sound familiar to us at church. And so from the day we heard, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you be filled with the knowledge of His will and all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so as to walk in the manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing Him, bearing fruit in every good work, and increasing in the knowledge of God. That sounds familiar to us in a church environment, right? We're asked to do things that please God. We're asked to live in a way that pleases God. We want to walk in a way that is worthy of the Lord. And we want to increase in the wisdom and in the knowledge of our God. And there's a reason for that. There is something that motivates that. And it's given to us in this text very specifically in verses 13 and 14. It makes the statement, Paul says, He was delivered, speaking of Jesus, He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of His beloved Son. God has taken us out of darkness and into light. And then verse 14 says, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. That's what motivates the former. That's why we strive to live in a way that is worthy of the Lord. That is why that we strive to please Him. But there is a danger in our doing. There is a temptation in our doing. And the danger of doing is a shift of trust. The danger in doing is that the trust that we had in God gets misplaced and we thereby trust more in ourselves. It's one of the great dangers that the Scripture speaks of from cover to cover. As we are studying in Romans on Sunday night, and by the way, come back at 5 o'clock tonight, Daniel Parrish is going to be taking a look at chapter 6 of Romans tonight. We've talked in Romans an awful lot so far about Abraham. You know, it's chapter 4, verse 3 of Romans where it says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Abraham trusted God. And the book of Romans, Paul in that discourse reminds us that the important thing was the trust in God. It was the fact that he trusted God. God said, Abraham, get up from where you are and go where I'm going to tell you. And he got up from where he was and he went where God said. And it wasn't what he did in the coming months and years that gained him favor in the sight of God, but it was that he trusted, that he believed, and that he moved. He moved and he acted. He was motivated because of that trust. I mean, imagine that level of trust. Abraham's life is okay. Things are going pretty well. God says, I want you to get up from where you are. I want you to go somewhere new. And I'm not going to tell you where. I just want you to go. And I want you to go because I've asked you to go. I mean, think of the level of trust. Most of the time, we don't even go from one room to another on that basis. I mean, how many times somebody in your household say, hey, come in here. What do you want? Well, come in here. You're going to want to see this. What is it? We want proof before we get up out of our chair of what we're going to and is it worth going for. You ever done a trust fall? Trust is difficult. You ever done a trust fall? How many of you here I've done a trust fall? That's a pretty good number. How many of you have done a trust fall off the ground? I mean, as in, I know for me, the trust fall that I did, I was 4 foot off the ground when I did the trust fall. That makes it a little more difficult. You see, I can think and I can just lay back. All I'm going to do is fall on the ground. Not a big deal. But when you're 4 foot off the ground, it's a little bit harder to do that. And you're just falling back. Boy, it's hard not to buckle your knees. Well, it's hard not to stop, to begin with. But it's really hard not to buckle your knees and try to get lower to the ground before you fall. Trust is a difficult thing. But yet we trust God. We do trust God. I find it interesting that people who do trust God sometimes to an extent, and then there's a point at which they're afraid to trust God beyond that. Ralph Waldo Emerson said it well when he said, all that I have seen teaches me to trust the Creator for all that I have not seen. All that I have seen teaches me to trust the Creator for what I have not seen. God has been right in what He said. He's promised and He has delivered. And the things that I still have questions about, and we all have questions about some things, trust God because of what you have seen for the things you have not seen. It's a good motto for going into the uncertainty and the uncertainties of life. Now move forward with me in time a little bit, if you will, to our text today of Deuteronomy chapter 8, talking about the Israelites inheriting the promised land. God's sort of in that position like you and I get occasionally when we're going to give somebody something very significant and we want to make sure they're responsible for it. The thought that comes to my mind is our children when they start to drive. You know, we give our children a car. When my girls were teenagers, I tended to say that if I'd had boys, I would have just said, hey, find a job, buy an old truck. When it tears up, then fix it. That's how I operated, you know. My first few cars, you had to learn to park on a hill. A lot easier to push. Well, you didn't have to push if you parked on the hill just right. Clutch it and go. But I had daughters. They're working till 9 o'clock at night at a part-time job. You kind of got to give them something that's dependable, you know. So when you give them something valuable, something that like that, you say, well, now you got to be responsible about this. Had a man come to me at church one day. He was a good friend of mine. He said, I don't know what to do. He said, his son was 16, 17 years old. He said, my son's not coming in at curfew. He's staying out all hours of the night. I said, how's he staying out all hours of the night? Well, he's in his truck. I said, why does he have a truck? He said, well, I gave him the truck. It's his truck. I said, that was a foolish thing to do. You give it with the understanding that if you're not responsible with it, then you don't have it anymore. Like I said, I had 3 girls. It wasn't a big deal. Only had one little issue with the girls in driving. Came home one night and I heard from the peanut gallery, the 2 younger sisters. Whoops, I didn't really say who that was. But I heard from the peanut gallery that sister was driving way too fast. Well, what's way too fast? Well, it was just way too fast. How fast was it, sister? It wasn't that fast. Well, now just tell me how fast was it? Well, I don't know, but it wasn't that fast. I hear another comment from the peanut gallery. It says, well, you know that thing on the dash, not the speedometer, but that other thing, it was at 5. 5,000 RPM in a 4-cylinder. It was whining. I said, now you don't talk about how fast again. And thankfully that was about the only driving problem we really had. That poor little car got wrecked 3 times before we finally got rid of it. Finally learned to pass it down through and let them, do their first wreck in the same car at least. But anyway, just a little wisdom to pass on to you there. Deuteronomy chapter 8. Deuteronomy chapter 8. Now, to get the context here, I want you to jump back in chapter 7 just for a minute. His emphasis here is, when you get there, remember who brought you. Remember who gave you this land. Oh, we're so forgetful, aren't we? We tend to forget. Now, in chapter 7, verse 17, and I use this because it's sort of the other opposite extreme of the dichotomy of doing here. It says, if you say in your heart, these nations are greater than I, how can I dispossess them? You shall not be afraid, but you shall remember what the Lord your God did to Pharaoh and to all of Egypt, the great trials that your eyes saw, and the signs and the wonders and the mighty hand, the outstretched arm by which the Lord your God brought you out. So will the Lord your God do to all the people of whom you are afraid. You see, the first thing they said in their heart is, we can't do this. You remember even in the time of spying out the land? Oh, we can't go in there. These people are giants. We can't handle this. We can't do this. But what God is concerned about is once they get there and get comfortable, they're going to start to think that they did this. Chapter 8, verse 11 in our text there. Here he says, take care lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments and his rules and his statutes which I command you today. And then he talks about why they might forget. He said, lest when you have eaten and are full and have built good houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks multiply, and your silver and gold multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart will be lifted up. In other words, you'll get to thinking pretty good about yourself. Then will your heart be lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrifying wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty ground where there was no water, who brought you water out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and test you to do you good in the end. And then verse 17. Beware lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand has gotten me this wealth. You see, that's the temptation, isn't it? We do out of gratitude. And then as we keep doing, we get to thinking pretty good of ourselves and pretty well of the things we do. And before long, we get to thinking that we're doing this ourselves. Now there's a great statement back down in chapter 9. This context keeps going. You know, for those people who kind of struggle with what happened in the Old Testament here, people who sort of ignorantly say, well, it's very ignorantly say, that, well, God just pushed those poor little Israelites out of their land, and the Canaanites out of the land, and gave it to his people, the Israelites, those poor Canaanite people. Well, we already know from Genesis that he's waiting 400 years to give them a chance to repent before he judges them as he gives his people the land. But here he says it in no uncertain terms. He says, do not, this is chapter 9 verse 4, do not say in your heart, after the Lord your God has thrust them out before you, it is because of my righteousness that the Lord has brought me in to possess this land. And if you don't get it in the first couple of verses, verse 6 gets very much more specific. He says, know therefore that the Lord your God is not giving you this good land to possess because of your righteousness, for you are a stubborn people. I don't know about you, but I'm willing to own that. I'm stubborn. Anybody else stubborn too? Don't make me sing. You know you are. It's who we are. Verse 17 again out of chapter 8, he says, beware lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand has gotten me these things. I struggle and you struggle to keep trusting God and not allow the shift of trust to happen. We're like the celebrity who forgets where they came from, and many do. Or like the athlete who, because he's 7 foot tall and can shoot a basketball, comes to believe that he's an expert on everything he wants to talk about. We too forget who we are. And we too forget what's been done for us. 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 9, but in the verses 5 through 8, he talks about the Christian graces. Add to your faith, virtue, and virtue knowledge, knowledge, temperance, self-control. So those are the Christian graces he says he wants us to add into our hearts and to emulate the example of our Lord Jesus by putting these things into our lives. And then he mentions in verse 8, for if these qualities are yours and are increasing, they help you, they keep you from being ineffective or unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. If these things be in you, King James says, and abound. But then verse 9, for whoever lacks these things is nearsighted, even to blindness, having forgotten that he was cleansed from his former sin. You see, the challenge is to live within ourselves. The challenge is to continue to do out of gratitude, not so as to receive. The challenge is to always remember who we used to be and where we used to be and what our God has done for us. And the challenge is to live within ourselves. On both extremes, he warned the Israelites in Deuteronomy chapter 7 and chapter 8. You see, sometimes we live below our humanity. We're living below our humanity. We're saying, I can't do this. I'm not big enough. I'm not good enough. I'm not wise enough. I can't do this. And then there are times we're living beyond our humanity. I did this. And we lose our humility in the process. A blessed people are challenged to remain humble. And see, we're double blessed. We live in a country at which we're literally physically blessed people. You say, well, if things aren't going great for me, you're still a blessed person by comparison to most of the world. And then we're servants and we're children of our God, which is all the spiritual blessings in heavenly places. We are a blessed people. And humility is hard to hang on to sometimes. Richard Foster, in one of the best definitions of humility I've ever seen, because humility gets sort of a bad definition. We define it in a very narrow and unfortunate way. Foster says this, he says, humility is not a less than type of abasement, but an ability to live as close to the truth as possible. The truth about ourselves, the truth about others, the truth about the world in which we live. In reality, humility is living as close to the truth as possible. The truth of who you are, the truth of who you are not, and the truth of who God is. And when you live according to that truth, then that's a humble life. Others have defined humility simply as knowing your place in the world and claiming it. There's a lot to be said. Whatever lot you find yourself in, there's a lot to be said for knowing our strengths and living in our strengths. Knowing our weaknesses and stepping back in our weaknesses and let somebody else lead. And there's few people, I would argue, that's learned to do that well. The reality is, when we're humble, we are just unfussily realistic. You look that up later, it's a word. We're just no-nonsense realistic about our strengths and about our weaknesses, about what we're capable of and what we're not capable of. We're also clear on the fact that we are not God, and it is our God who has blessed us and brought us here in a place where we have hope for eternity. Because we cannot heal or transform ourselves on our own. Thus, when growth and good change happens, it's only in humility that we can identify this as God's help and God's provision for us. You see, when we're proud, we don't have an accurate picture of the way things really are. We believe we're engineering our own progress, and we wonder why we don't see God moving in our lives. And the reality is we don't see God moving in our lives because we think we're doing it all. We're not even looking for God. We're just proud of who we are and what we've done. And that reality might be just another layer of what the Apostle Paul meant when he told us that we would best know God's strengths seen through our own weaknesses. Because that's when we see what God can do That's when we see what God has done. And we will be so blessed if we will keep ourselves very much aware of those truths. As we sing this song of encouragement, as we offer this invitation, if there are things that you'd like to lay before your God this morning, if there are things you'd like to lay before your elders, have them pray with you. If there are things you would like to lay before your church family this morning, let us know your struggles, let us know your needs. Lay it at the feet of our God as we stand and as we sing, we invite you.